All right, chapter 5, the middle of it, a peaceful fight. In 1959, Martin did agree to take Coretta along on a trip to India. Martin wanted to see the land where his hero Gandhi had lived. As he traveled through the country, he saw that India was divided between the very poor and the very rich. Many people did not have jobs. Many slept out on the streets. Rich people, on the other hand, had beautiful homes and fancy clothes. Yet even with so much poverty, there was peace among the people. Yes, they were poor, but they did not take their troubles out on anybody. Martin visited some of the places that were special to Gandhi. He and his group went to a place called Bambi. It was there that Gandhi had started to walk a walk of more than 200 miles to protest a tax on salt. Gandhi's walk began with 8 people. The number grew to thousands. Some say that more than 1 million people ultimately joined the walk. Gandhi told his people, if you are hit, don't hit back. Even if they shoot you, don't shoot back. Just keep moving. Martin had a wonderful experience in India. When he returned home, he was even more convinced of the power of peaceful protest. In 1959, the King family moved from Montgomery to Atlanta. It was hard to leave Montgomery, but Martin wanted more time for his civil rights work. He could not be a full-time minister. He told his congregation, history has thrust something on me which I cannot turn away. In Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. would become the co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, his father's church. By the year 1960, the civil rights movement was spreading throughout the South. Black students and white students staged sit-ins at lunch counters. Students would sit together at a whites-only lunch counter and wait to be served. Often, the police would drag them out, but the students never fought back when arrested. Sometimes people yelled and spit at the other students. Some threw rocks at them. No matter how many students were put in jail, the next day others would go sit in at the same lunch counters. They kept on because the fight was something they believed in. Martin took part in the sit-ins. On October 19, 1960, he was arrested at a lunch counter in the department store in Atlanta. Over 200 students were arrested that same day. They were all taken to the Fulton County Jail. Martin told the judge that the sit-ins pointed out racial injustice. He wanted to make people in Atlanta see how wrong it was to have whites-only eating places. He said, I must honestly say that we firmly believe that segregation is evil. 5 days passed, and Martin and the students were still in jail. Black people in Atlanta were very worried. Finally, the store owners dropped the charges and everyone was set free. But many white people were still angry with Martin. They wanted him back in jail. On May 4th, 1960, the police stopped Martin in his car. They gave him a ticket for driving in Georgia with an Alabama license plate and driver's license. Martin thought, at worst, he would just pay the fine in court. Instead, Martin was taken away, his legs put in chains, and driven to a state prison more than 200 miles away. The ride to the prison was long. Martin was hungry. He was thirsty. He was scared. When his followers learned what had happened to Martin, they tried their best to get him out of prison. They made calls to Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy, who were running against each other for president. At first, neither man wanted to help. They were afraid of angering the white voters. When reporters asked Nixon about Martin Luther King Jr. being in jail, Nixon said, no comment. Finally, one of Kennedy's friends convinced the senator to help. First, Kennedy called Martin's wife, Coretta. She was pregnant with their 3rd child, and she was very upset. John F. Kennedy told Coretta that he and his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was also a lawyer, would do everything in their power to help Martin. Robert Kennedy called the judge who sent Martin to jail. He wanted to know why Martin couldn't post bail. Bail is money paid to the court that allows someone to remain free until the trial. Now the judge agreed to set bail. Martin was freed. Kennedy campaign workers printed millions of leaflets that said Nixon's no comment remark showed that he was a man without a heart. Martin's father, Martin Luther King Sr., decided to vote for Kennedy now. John F. Kennedy won the election that November. He was the first Roman Catholic president. Catholics in the United States had faced prejudice too. That was one of the reasons many black people voted for JFK. Perhaps his own experience as a Catholic would make him more understanding of the problems of race in America. And there's a picture of JFK. Very important president in the United States. Chapter 6, Freedom Riders. By 1961, there were not as many white-only lunch counters left in the South, but far too many waiting rooms, bathrooms, and restaurants in bus and train stations still had separate areas for blacks and whites. It didn't matter that the courts said this was legal. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to President Kennedy, but the president did not take quick action to fix the situation. On May 4th, 1961, a group of students boarded 2 buses in Washington, D.C. They were traveling to the South. At some of the rest stops, the black students sat in the whites-only waiting rooms. Again, they were staging peaceful protests. In Anniston, Alabama, the tires of one of the buses were shot out. A bomb was thrown in the window of the other bus. As the frightened riders ran out of the bus, they were attacked. The trip was over. But the students did not give up. More groups rode buses from the north to the south. Again, students were attacked. Many were put in jail. These brave young people became known as Freedom Riders. One night, a group of Freedom Riders held a meeting in a church in Montgomery, Alabama, where Martin came to speak. A crowd outside threw stones and bottles at the church, but Martin urged everyone to stay strong. Together, they sang the freedom song, "We Shall Overcome." Finally, the angry crowd left. Here's a map of where they traveled. Here's a picture of the church being attacked. Was this the end of segregation in these places? No. The bus station in Albany, Georgia, for example, refused to give up a whites-only waiting room. So a man named Dr. W.G. Anderson started a group called the Albany Movement. This group staged sit-ins and boycotts. For months, Martin led marches all over Albany. Once again, Martin was put in jail. Martin wanted to serve his sentence of 45 days. After only a couple days, however, Martin was freed. He had also been kicked off buses and out of stores, and now he was being kicked out of a jail. Yet, after all the marches and more time in jail, Martin and the rest of the leaders of the Albany movement were faced with defeat. The segregation laws in Albany remained, at least for the time being. While some people might have given up, Martin looked at the setback as a beginning. His fight would continue. I was trying to read one more chapter. Chapter 7, Freedom Comes to Birmingham. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that the civil rights movement would suffer defeats, but now he was more determined than ever to prove the power of peaceful protest. He looked for the city with the toughest Jim Crow laws. It was Birmingham, Alabama. If Albany, Georgia was bad, Birmingham was worse. Schools were still segregated in Birmingham. The water fountains were marked colored or white. Birmingham's police commissioner was Bull Connor. He was very tough on black people. He made them afraid to speak out against Jim Crow laws. Even the white people who did not like segregation were afraid to say anything. Martin and the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, had a plan. Besides sit-ins at lunch counters, meetings were held at black churches all around Birmingham. At churches, protesters talked to people. They talked about peaceful protest. They sang freedom songs. "We shall overcome, black and white together. We shall overcome someday." As Martin knew, the songs inspired a crowd. They gave black people courage for a good cause. The Birmingham protests began. After 3 days of sit-ins, 35 people had been arrested. Now it was time for the second part of Martin's plan. Martin and the leaders of the SCLC decided to boycott white businesses. Martin knew this would anger store owners. Almost half the people living in Birmingham were black. Without black customers, stores would have a hard time making money. On April 6th, Martin organized a march to the Birmingham City Hall. Many people joined this march. Bull Connor was growing angry. He and the policemen took clubs and beat some of the protesters. Police dogs were let loose, but the people did not run away. Instead, they became stronger. Here's a illustration of one of the pictures from that day. It's like a very famous image and even video. There's a video of it too. After 10 days, 500 people had been sent to jail. Some were released on bail, but around 300 remained locked up. Up until this time, Martin had not taken part in the marches. If he joined in, then he'd be arrested. And if he was in jail, he wouldn't be able to stay in charge. On April 12th, Martin and the other leaders of the protest met in Martin's hotel room. Martin's father and brother were there too. Martin Luther King Sr. wanted his son to come home. Easter was on Sunday, and he wanted Martin back at church to preach. Some of the other leaders thought Martin should stay and lead a protest. Other leaders did not want him to march because they feared he would be arrested. And still, others thought that Martin should try to raise money to bail out protesters from jail. An argument started. Martin left the room to think and pray. When he returned, he was wearing jeans. He wore jeans whenever he went to jail. Martin had made up his mind. He would join the protesters and their next march. Just as expected, Martin was arrested. Usually, he was able to call Coretta right away, but this time he was not allowed to make a call. After 2 days, Coretta, who had recently given birth to their 4th child, became frantic. Martin had been put in a jail cell all by himself. No one was allowed to visit, not even his lawyers. The cell was small and very dark. The only light came from a tiny window near the ceiling. Martin was scared. He worried about his wife and family. He worried about other protesters. Even white ministers were against Martin. In a letter to the Birmingham News, 8 white pastors said that the protest was wrong. They felt the SCLC should not break laws. They said that Martin and his group were stirring up hatred and violence. In response, Martin wrote a long letter. Since he did not have any paper in jail, he wrote on the edges of newspapers. He even wrote on toilet paper. In this letter, Martin said that people should obey just laws, but they should disobey unjust laws. Even so, he said, they should always behave peacefully, and people should be ready to accept punishment for disobeying the law. Martin willingly served his time in jail. After 8 days, he was released. Martin could see the light of day again. Now, one of Martin's advisors had a new plan. He wanted to organize a children's march. At first, Martin was against this plan. Wasn't it too dangerous? But Martin's advisors did not think that the police would throw children in jail. Thousands of Birmingham children, from 6 years old to teenagers, were trained in peaceful protest. They joined together in marches, and yes, some children were put in jail. On May 2nd, a huge demonstration was planned. Thousands of young people wanted to take part. At one black school, the principal locked up the gates to keep the students inside, but they climbed over the gates. This march was too important to miss. They were marching for freedom. Bull Connor and his men came to the march too. They brought clubs to beat the protesters. Police dogs ripped at the marchers' clothes. The police knocked down people with blasts of water from giant fire hoses. Then the home of Martin's brother was firebombed. Other bombs were sent around the city. But reporters were there too, and cameramen. They wrote stories. They filmed what was happening. By the 1960s, most American homes had a television. Through television, people became more connected to the outside world. It was one thing to read about an attack in a newspaper. It was quite different to see it happening on TV. Martin understood the power of television. He was glad that this struggle was being brought into people's living rooms on a daily basis. Americans were outraged. Many white business leaders in Birmingham were fed up. But what upset many of the most was not the violence, but all the lost business. They held a meeting and decided to give in on some of the marchers' demands. These were some of the promises. Lunch counters, restrooms, fitting rooms, and drinking fountains would be desegregated. Blacks would be able to get better jobs. The protesters in jail would be released. A committee of black people and white people would be formed to help ease tensions between the races. At last, the Jim Crow laws in Birmingham were lifted. Martin had won a great victory. Oh. And there's a picture of a TV set inside of somebody's living room in like the 1960s. So it's an old school TV. It looks a little different than we have today. Ours are much bigger. And that is the end of chapter 7.